Thank you for what we will see of your Son and his heart and your love for us in the passage tonight. I pray this will be an honor to you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, now last week we finished up the passage in chapter 8. We did verse 12 to 26. Or is that 22 to 26? There's no way I would have done 12 to 26 in one class. But we did 22 to 26. And I ended by telling you that this is a twin story to the story that starts in chapter 7:31 and runs through chapter 37. And I want to give you the similarities between them. And I'm not doing this just to be pedantic or cute. I think that there's something in the things that are the same that widen out our understanding of Jesus and the circumstance and what God is trying to tell us in these passages. So I'm going to go through them, and I need to tell Jeff that I have one more than I gave you, so I don't know if you were going to put them up or what you were going to do, but there's one that you don't have, and I'll let you know when we get to that, okay? What I'd like to do is I'm going to read the story of the deaf man, and then I'm going to read the story of the blind man, so we can have them both in our heads, and then I'll just go through the things that I believe Mark is, and Peter when he tells the stories, and Mark when he writes them down, is making work to give us a deeper understanding of Jesus. Okay, and that's what I want to do first, and then we'll move on to the other thing. But I just felt it was important that I do this. So let me just read, we're going to go back and read, I'm at 31 in chapter 7. I'm just going to read it, and then I'll go to the other story. Jesus left Tyre and went up to Sidon before going back to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the 10 towns. And a deaf man with a speech impediment was brought to him, and the people begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man to heal him. Jesus led him away from the crowd so they could be alone, and he put his fingers into the man's ears. Then, spitting on his own fingers, he touched the man's tongue. Looking up to the heavens, he sighed and said, Ephphatha, which means be opened. Instantly the man could hear perfectly, and his tongue was freed so he could speak plainly. And Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone, but the more he told them not to, the more they spread the news. They were completely amazed and said again and again, everything he does is wonderful. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who cannot speak. Now jump over to verse 22 in chapter 8. And when they arrived in Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch the man and heal him. Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Then, spitting on the man's eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked, "Can you see anything now?" And the man looked around. "Yes, I see people, but I can't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around." Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and his eyes were opened, and his sight was completely restored, and he could see everything clearly. And Jesus sent him away, saying, "Don't go back into the village on your way home." Okay, it's pretty obvious when I read those two back to back. You can see the narrative similarities, the things in the story that are the same. And actually, the similarities fall into two categories. One is those narrative aspects that are pretty obvious, and we'll talk about them. But the other is the Greek that he uses to tell these stories. And here's the thing: it's sometimes when people when they're writing in the ancient Greek literature, they try, and we see this in the Gospel of John. John tries his best to never say the same thing twice with the same words, because he's trying to seem erudite and that he's good with the language. But then other times when they give the same words, this week I'm going to preach on something where Jesus, in about this much talking, says the same big, odd, almost unpronounceable Greek word 4 times. And so you know that he's doing what? He's emphasizing something that we need to pay attention to. And so the point is to look at that carefully. And we have both of those things going on here in this story. So I'm just going to say the other thing is this, that as we get into these similarities, he's not, as I said, he's not simply doing this to make his stories read the same or have the same sort of style. Nope. In every similarity, there is an important reality about Jesus that we need to take note of. Both of these stories take place in an area that is somewhat Jewish and Gentile at the same time. The descriptions of these places leave whether or not Jesus is healing a Jewish man brought by Jewish people or a Gentile man brought by Gentile people unanswered. That is an unanswered question in both stories. Now, if we think about that for a minute, what that means is that we can go either way. Or we can say they're mixed. We can do anything we want to with them. But there is something about the fact that these healings are simply for human people. People, whether they're Jewish or Gentile. And whatever it is, it shows God's what? His concern. He's not limiting his healing of these people to just the Jews. This is a strong statement by not telling us who these people are, that God is interested in the nations. And that's a really important thing to notice about Jesus, because we're going to find out really soon that he's the what? He's the Messiah. And it's good to know that the Messiah cares about all people. So these stories don't give us a hint. We have these nebulous spaces. So that's the first one. And the second one is that in both stories, the man who has an infirmity is brought to Jesus by a group of people that is undefined. It never says more than they bring. They bring. We don't know if this is family. We don't know if this is townspeople who know him. There's even some hint in some commentators that it might be people who are just tired of him being around. But one thing that it does tell us is that Jesus responds to these people simply because he has compassion, and he sees their desire for this man to be what? Taken out from under this infirmity. So Jesus has a compassionate response to a group of people without reference. If it's his family, we could all get that. But if it's just a bunch of people that live in town, it's a different thing. And so we see in Jesus, his response is simply to their desire to have something happen to somebody they care about that he desires to see something happen to that he cares about. Does this make sense? I just want to make sure I'm making sense of it. Okay, number 3, did you notice that both groups of people came to Jesus and they begged him? They beg him. Both cases, both stories, it's a parakalusin, same word, same form, both times in the present tense. It makes it something that's just right at you. These are people that are coming to Jesus out of what? Deep emotional desire. This is what they have. They have a deep emotional desire to see this man taken out from under this weight that is making his life miserable. It's making his life different and hard. And Jesus' response to their begging is what? He responds to them. When they come to, now that word can mean to call out with great fervor. It's also sometimes used, I'm pretty sure, for prayer. And so this is important to me. They come to him with an attitude that is similar to what would be described as prayer. And what do we see Jesus do? He responds. This is our Jesus we're talking about. And he responds because he sees what? Their heart, and his heart goes with them. I think this is cool, actually. I know, I'm sorry that it may be like you're all going, why is Tim talking about this? But I just think it's really cool. And the next thing in both stories, they beg him to touch or lay their hands on the person, implying healing. It never says to heal him. The text never says that they asked him to heal him. I'm going to tell you a personal story, okay? And I'm not dropping anything here, but I had the privilege of sitting in Bill Gaither's recording studio. This is going to make me emotional. And for about 2 hours, he played me all of his songs and told me how he wrote his songs on a piano, and you just get to sit. And when he got to, he touched me, we know what he said. He said, there's a story in the Bible where people came and they just said, could Jesus just touch them? And he was what? They were made whole. The people brought him to Jesus and they didn't even have to say what they wanted. They just said, touch him. Why? Because they'd come to a point where they believed that his touch would make him whole. And that is a powerful statement about the reality of I would say the existential nature of our God, the one who loves us, that his touch will make us whole. That's another of and I'm probably getting out of order, but another one of the things is that when Jesus brings about the healing, it says very clearly that he can hear perfectly. He can see clearly. They are taken back to the ultimate level of that which God created us to be able to hear and see. They are taken back to what is, I would say, the essence of our creation. That which I don't have either of right now. My hearing is terrible, and I'm sure my sight is not there. But that is a part of it. I also think that there's something very, and I use the word carefully, eschatological about their healing, because there will be a day when I stand before the God of the universe, and I will be able to hear as I was meant to be able to hear, and see as I was meant to be able to see. And Jesus in this moment fast forwards to that which God has for us someday with these. Does this make sense? Does this make sense? Anyway, that's just cool. Now, did I get you out of line there? Yeah. I did. I'm sorry, Jeff. I jumped to number 8. No, to number 9. Okay, one of them is this, and Jeff, you don't have this one. It's that in both stories, they are told with no nouns. Both of these stories never say Jesus, never say anybody's name, never say the disciples, nothing. It's just all he, they, he, them, they, he, like that. And I think that the reason is that we're supposed to take all of this just sort of broad pronoun talk and be able to throw ourselves into the story. Does that make sense? We don't, because if we had names and if it said the leadership of the town of Bethsaida, the elders of the community or something like that, brought him or something to that effect, or if it even gave him a name, gave these men names. One thing I'm going to tell you, and this is an aside, anytime you find the name of someone in the New Testament stories and even in the book of Acts, where someone is named in a story, like Bartimaeus or Nicodemus or any of these people that get named as they're telling the gospel, the reason is that at the time they were still alive and you could go find them and talk to them and find out if they were telling the truth about them. There's a lot of work on that recently, and it's very clear that the eyewitnesses, when they're named, were still living at the time of their writing. This one is very neutral because it's not only it's neutral so that it's a universal story. Does that make sense? It's not only specific to these two men, which is wonderful, but it's also a universal story about everything, that we can all be anybody in the story. Does that make sense? Anyway, okay, let me go on from there. And I've got more stuff in the notes if that doesn't make any sense, or if that doesn't make sense, write to me and I'll try to clear it up for you. Okay, in each story, Jesus leads the man away from the crowd in order to be alone with him. You know, when we think about the God of the universe, sometimes, it's not hard, because of the way I've been brought up in evangelicalism, to think that he's actually paying attention to me. But just the thought of every single human being on the planet actually being someone he is personally knowledgeable, he has personal knowledge of them and cares about them, that's a hard one. This moment shows great compassion for individuals. Think about it with the deaf man. He takes him away. He couldn't speak and express himself, and he couldn't hear anything. Now, can you imagine how confusing that would have been if he'd been drug out to meet Jesus? Now, think about it a minute. People take him and they bring him out to a guy that they can't tell him who he is or what it's about. And he can't ask any questions. So what does Jesus do? He takes him and separates him from everybody so that he can what? Look him in the eyes and let him see in some manner, some kind of communication that you're in okay hands right now. Somebody cares about you. Same thing with the blind man. I have no way to know what it would be like to only be able to function just by hearing. But if suddenly this healer or this prophet shows up, they didn't have anybody text ahead, there wasn't a poster up to tell people Jesus is coming on next week at Tuesday at 3. They didn't have any idea. He just shows up. Somebody sees him, recognizes him, and everybody goes crazy. And can you imagine? He's a blind man who's probably begging, and somebody comes and grabs him and starts dragging him off to some place. And it's and everybody's making noise, and there's tons of stuff going on, and it's a big, wild scene. Well, it's no wonder that Jesus took him by the hand and walked him away from everybody so that he could do what? He could say, it's okay. Settle down. It's nothing to be afraid of. We don't know much of their conversation. Jesus doesn't give us much of it. And yet this shows what? Deep compassion for the circumstances of an individual. I'm glad that our Savior is that person. I'm really glad. I'm glad that I'm just not a one in billions of created people who would just are disgusting, and he just had to go die so that we wouldn't be so disgusting. He knows me. He knows me. He knows you. And I don't know whether if he came to the room, it'd be interesting to see who among us he would say, you need to be taken away for a little bit and I need to talk to you. But you three need to sit right here while I talk to you. He'd know. I think that's special, that we need to make note of that. Okay. Is this helpful? I just want to make sure, nobody's going to go, no, but I just want to make sure that you're with me. Now, in both stories, Jesus uses his own spit in the process of healing. This is unexplained in both stories, but this is back to that thing where, and this is what I need to write the book about, but this is one of those things where everybody believes something is real and it's not, and yet God still uses it to do something bigger. Is that, because, let's be honest. Is there healing power in people's spit? And I know he's Jesus, okay? I know he's Jesus. But the deal was that everybody believed there was healing power in the spit of a healing man. They all believed it. This is true of so much stuff in the Bible, that people believed something was real and it's not, but God still used it to show a greater truth. And so Jesus, when he spit and healed, it works because he's God, he's Jesus. But he's using a method that makes everybody else comfortable because they think there's a power in the spit of a healing man. So he does this rather than going, now listen, you guys are all thinking I should put some spit on this guy because it's going to heal him. You're wrong about that. He doesn't do that. He does what they expect that a very serious healer would do when he's confronted with a difficult situation, something that everybody says, this is an impossibility. And so he's going to show them that it's not by using the most, organic, strong method of healing that they know about. And that's this, spitting on him. What does that say to me? That says that my Savior is perfectly willing to work with all of my ignorances to bring me to greater truths. He's willing to work with all of my blind spots to bring me to deeper things about him that are true. I am confident that, what was it that, I don't even want to say his name, we were told in the movie Sleeper that in 200 years we'll find out that hot fudge is the best food for us in terms of our health. And that 200 years earlier, all that talk about don't eat hot fudge because it's not good for you was just not true, okay? I'm sure there is something that we are all living with right now that we think is absolutely 100% proof true, and it's not. And my bet is that there's some things about the nature of the world and God's work in the world that he will correct us on when we get face to face with him. But in the meantime, he's perfectly willing, as long as it's not going against his character and his deeper truth, he's perfectly willing to work with that stuff with us and just let us move on. He'll use it to take us someplace higher. Now, I know that's a complicated thing. I really want to write that book. But and I've been saying that for years, but I took a sabbatical and I wasn't going to write that book on it, okay? It's just, I'm telling you, my sabbatical was not for book writing. But that's what's happening here. That our Savior is willing to use anything to show us a greater truth. And what's the greater truth here? He can heal this man. He doesn't have to spit on him. He doesn't have to touch him. He just has to command the man's body to return to that which it was supposed to be, and yet he does it in a way that everybody feels comfortable about the way that he went about it. So that's another thing. Okay, in both stories, Jesus' hands play a role. The healing, it's not a magician's trick. I think it's the same thing. Everybody believed that the most powerful thing that a person could do, as that was a healing person, was to put their hands on someone. We still do that. We still put our hands on people when we pray for them. We still reach out. I mean, you know how we do that, all that. But they come to him and they say, would you lay your hands on him? That's all they say. Would you put your hands on him? The implication is that something's going to come out of him to heal him, and Jesus does that. Even though he didn't have to, he is willing to answer their prayer in order to get to the end result, which is the healing. So to catch that, he's willing to do what they ask to get to something. It also makes it possible for them to say, we ran into Jesus. Can you believe it? He came here, and we asked him to lay his hands on this man, and he did. He did. He did what we asked. Isn't that amazing? He's the kind of man who would do what he's asked. He listens and does. I like that. In both stories, the result, I said this earlier, is perfect healing. The deaf man hears perfectly, and the blind man sees everything. And finally, in both stories, Jesus seems to want the healed person or the people around him not to tell anybody And I've already said this last week, but what's really going on here is that there is something in the moment that makes it better for these people not to be publicly known. And I talked about that when I taught these, but this is not a grand plan on Jesus' part to keep his messiahship or his power or any of that stuff a secret. He's trying to protect these people. And I love that about these stories because Jesus wants literally no particular glory in the moment, because for the moment, it's better for these people to go back to their families and just be able to live their lives as opposed to be whooping things up and bringing attention to the fact that can you imagine? These people are going to be known for the rest of their lives anyway as the guy that was deaf and mute and can now talk and hear. And a blind man is going to be, he lost his sight and then Jesus gave it back to him. He's going to be that person for the rest of his life. If you think about these things, do you remember when Jesus raised that little girl from the dead? And he said, don't tell anybody? There's all kinds of things connected to that one where if her reputation was that she'd been dead and was brought back to life, for the rest of her life, everybody go, well, what was that about? And she'd probably never get to be married, and there's all kinds of things that could happen to her. This little girl who's young, was she 13 or 13? Or she's 13, I think. It's like, my goodness. Jesus gets what those people need. Why? Because he's a compassionate man who sees beyond the moment and knows what's best for everybody. And it's different for everybody. Okay, those are the things that I saw that were common. That's powerful to me that Mark would put these two stories as bookends in this section, and they tell us these things how many times? Twice. If we have it once, we can figure something out, but if we have it identically twice, then we know we better pay attention. And if you go back and list out every one of those things that it says about who Jesus is in this moment, you're going to get a list that is completely different than what people expected of the Messiah. And I don't think it's any coincidence at all that the very next story after the blind man who is given, the blind man who's given sight, is when Peter and the disciples are going to finally make the strong statement about who Jesus is, that he is the Messiah. That's where we're going next. And they've been trying to answer this question all along. Who is this man? And in these two stories that say the same things over and over, we get a list of stuff that almost is exclusively about Jesus' personal concern for an individual. And it doesn't matter where he's from or what nation he is from. It doesn't matter who his friends are or anything. What it matters is that Jesus cares about that person and he knows them deeply. And that's the thing we're supposed to take out of this. Who is this man? He is somebody who knows your infirmity. He knows where you're broken. And he also knows how to bring you healing. I think that's cool. I think that it's a powerful moment in the Gospel of Mark. I'm sure that Peter, later on, after Jesus had been raised from the dead, had time to think about it. Can you imagine? He's thinking, oh, wow, when that deaf man got healed, there was a lot of stuff that happened that was very similar to when that blind man got healed. And he's thinking, those similarities matter. They matter, and he would know far more details than we do. And you say, okay, now I get why Jesus was so kind to me. And why Jesus spoke that way to me. Because he wants to speak that way to everybody. I say in the notes, and I said it at the end of class last time, these two stories are only in Mark. They're not in any of the other Gospels. And the reason is this, I believe. I don't think Matthew wanted to touch this story because he was there. But the Jesus spitting on people and all that stuff, Jews were somewhat suspicious of people who did things that seemed like magic. So Matthew's going, I'm not so sure about those stories. I don't think I want to include those. Plus, I read Mark's book, and he talks about him, and he did a good job. And then Luke comes along, and he's reading all this stuff and talking to people and trying to figure out what to write down because he's being paid to find out the truth about Jesus. And guess what? He's got 2 stories of miraculous healing, and he doesn't have a clue who the people are. Because Mark doesn't tell us who they are. He knows he can go there and visit and ask around, but he doesn't really want to go up there. He's living probably in northern Egypt or something like that. And so what does he do? He can't find anybody that can. And he goes, well, Mark already wrote about him. He did a good job. So I'll just leave him out. So we get him in Mark. John doesn't write about him because, well, John doesn't want to talk about anything that anybody else has talked about, so John just doesn't write them down. And so what do we get? We get 2 stories that Peter couldn't help but bring himself to tell over and over and over and over using the same language. Because you know that Mark is translating what Peter said into the Greek that is almost the same in the 2 stories. And why does he tell us those stories? Because they are the essence of the good news. That Jesus wants to what? He rose from the dead so that he could touch us spiritually and make us whole. And it's right there twice. You can't miss it. And he said it over and over and over. And so Mark says, I got to keep these in my book because this is the gospel. We've come to the central passage in the book of Mark. This passage is the final, I almost said pericope, which is the terminology that we use in theological classes. I see Brad Miller back there laughing. This is the final story of the first half. And everything up to the first half is led to here. And then it's going to turn a corner right in the middle of this passage, and we're going to start the second half. And I want to make sure that you know that I am so excited about this passage, I can hardly stand it because it's got so much. It's very short, but it's still just packed. Those are the notes that I have on these 3 verses. So it's like tons of stuff. And what's going to happen is that Jesus, in the very next set of 3 verses, is going to tell us exactly what the rest of the book is about. And then it's going to follow that pattern right on out. The first half, we get a question that we get answered for a long time. The second half, he says, what's going to happen to him? And then that's all that we find out about. It's Jesus going to the cross and rising from the dead. That's exactly how the book is divided. Now, I will say this. Almost all commentators believe, and I'll read it in a minute, that the next 6 verses are one hunk. I've been looking carefully at the Greek in this, and I get it. I do think the ideas move, but I'm going to read it as one in a minute. But they say that it's an unfortunate aspect of people who make Bibles that they divide this thing in half, and they don't put the division where it should be. But I just want to say this. They're probably right. But I think the best way to study these 2 halves of the one section, the first 3 verses and then the next 3 verses, is to look at them separately and then draw them together later, rather than try to put them together as one, because there's so much in each one. They have very different subjects, but they seem to all have happened at the same moment. Does that make sense? But so anyway, we're going to look at the first 3 verses on their own. I think it's 3. On their own. Then we'll go to the next ones, and then we'll bring them together. And so let me read these, and then we'll go from there. This is 27 of chapter 8. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" "Well," they replied, "some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets." Then he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders and the leading priests and the teachers of the religious law. That he would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. And as he talked openly about this with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Do you see how those can work as one thing? But I don't want to we're not going to get into the get behind me and all that Satan stuff and all that. We're not even going to go to that section. Right now, we're just going to concentrate on up through where Jesus says he warned them not to tell anyone about him. Now, if you remember, and I just said it a few minutes ago, that the section that we just read has no proper nouns in it. It's all just they and them and all that. Well, this section starts out immediately giving us proper nouns because it starts out saying, and went forth Jesus and his disciples. So Mark wants to make sure we know who we're talking about now. We are talking about Jesus and the people, and it's actually it's the disciples of him. It's very possessive. We know that these are his specific disciples. So we know who we're talking about right now. And that's important because what we don't want to have is somebody who shows up in the midst of all of this when Jesus is finally being identified for who he actually is, and have it come from somebody who hasn't been hanging around all the time. This is those people that are his disciples, the disciples of Jesus. And so we get that right off at the beginning. And then it's, and it says they went forth. Where is it? I'm sorry, it's went up to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, or went out of Bethsaida and traveled to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Now, there's a lot to say about this geographical place. Mark does not tend to give us the names of a geographical place without a strong reason. And there are some really important reasons for us to know exactly where they are right now, that they've left Galilee and they're going up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. First, what this does not say, okay? It does not say that Jesus was going to Caesarea Philippi. It says clearly that he was going to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. The way things were done back then, that there would be a town that was a central location, and it would have some sort of governmental center. It would be the center of commerce and such, and the villages around it would all be owned, if you will, or controlled by this central place. Jesus is not going. Do we have a picture of it? How did they get a drone photograph of Caesarea Philippi in the first century? I'm just saying. Well, he's going to the places where the people live in the outer districts, and they come into this town when they need to do some business, when they need to buy stuff that they can't supply for themselves in the villages. These are the suburbs of this town, and there's a reason for this. And I said this last week, but many towns were forcibly renamed Caesarea out of honor to Caesar. There's a bunch of Caesareas this and Caesareas that. There's a huge one that people get mixed up all the time. It's called Caesarea Maritime, and it's on the coast, and it was built by Herod too, and it's a great big seaport, and I think people get it mixed up with this one. But this town, is it still up there, the picture? This town had a history that would have made it a place that Jewish Jews, and I use that carefully, Jewish Jews, is that, you know what I'm saying? And a Jewish Jesus and his Jewish disciples would not likely have chosen to go to. they would have avoided it. The villages around this town were very remote. This area was remote, and there would have been a perfect place to do what we learn in other Gospels Jesus wanted to do with his disciples, and it was that he wanted to go someplace private so they could pray and he could teach them. So he doesn't have any business in this town. He's just going to someplace that he knows is way out in the middle of no place so they can just be by themselves, okay? And this town is about 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. That's 25, great, there's a map, there it is. See it up there? And they were down here at Bethsaida, and they're going to walk up there. This town is located on one of the headwaters of the River Jordan. The land all around this was known. It's really, the land there is right on where this takes place. It's on the side of Mount Hermon. It was really green and highly fertile. There'd been a city in this place for a long, long time, and the locale was known for its beauty. In fact, the original town that was built there, the original town, what's up there now? Okay. See where Mount Hermon is, and see where Caesarea Philippi is down here. The original town that was built there was called Panion, or Panias. It was named for the Greek god Pan. And Pan was the god of nature and wild places and such. Did you know we get the word panic from the god Pan? Well, yeah, because Pan was always like being crazy and wild. And in fact, you didn't build a temple to worship Pan. You worshiped him and I can't figure this word out, but in grottos. A grotto is a cave, okay? There was a cave where they had set up a worship space for Pan, and that's what this area was known for. It was not, oh, is that a picture of it? It is. How do you find this stuff? Oh, those are people down there, weren't they? Oh, wait. Okay, that's great, because what happened was this, that Herod the Great, which, by the way, can I just tell you, when they say Herod the Great, that just means the first. It doesn't mean he was super, okay? It's just he was first. Herod the Great gave this area, he gave it to Herod and told him he could rule over it. And Herod built a temple there to Caesar Augustus. So see, there's a temple of Augustus near the grotto where they worshipped Pan. And the temple was built to make sure that Caesar knew that he was really thankful and that they were all going to worship Caesar there. Instead of Pan, they're going to worship Caesar as a god. Now, if you're starting to see what I'm saying, and Herod's son Philip inherited control of all this area from his father, and in 3 BC he rebuilt the whole town nearby. He rebuilt everything nearby the village, this village of Panias, and what he actually did was he turned it into his residence. So this is Herod's son Philip, who's ruling in the northern area. He doesn't rule Galilee, he doesn't rule Judea, but he rules nearby. He's built his residence in a town that they've renamed. By the way, his son was named Philip, and he renames the town Caesarea Philippi after the Roman emperor and himself. And he moves in and he sets up this town, and it is as Roman a town as you can imagine. And what they do there is they occasionally party to honor Pan, but for the most part, they give great fealty to the godness of Caesar. Now, can you see why a Jewish guy would just really not rather go to Caesarea Philippi? Because what he's going to run into is a whole bunch of people who worship the god Pan and Caesar as a god. Now, whether they believed he was a god or not is not the important part. It's just that they needed to make enough noise and do enough stuff that the word could get back to Caesar and Rome, that those people back there in Caesarea Philippi really love you and they worship you as a god. I've heard many times that Augustus, when he heard he was being worshiped as a god, found it odd. But he said, if they want to do that, that's fine with me. But if they turned the spigot off because Jews showed up and said, we're not going to worship him anymore, I think there'd have been trouble. Do you see the point? So Jesus is going to a place where Jews would not normally go. Why? Because he wants to go someplace remote so he can pray and talk to his disciples. Is this making sense? What's happening here? Yeah. Anyway, this city had really strong Roman connections. And I've got tons of references, and you'll have them in the notes, about the recognition of Caesar's lordship that went on in this town. And two interesting things about this being the location where Jesus' messiahship is initially recognized by the disciples. And that's this, that both Herod and his son Philip both claimed to be Jewish, and both claimed at times, even though they were Jewish, they claimed to be the sons of God. Okay? And Philip himself lived in a town where they would not only worship Caesar, but he probably felt it was appropriate for people to treat him in the same manner. Anyway, this town was a place where, you'll get all that. Let's see how I got it. Boy, I've got a lot of stuff in here about that. Okay, Jesus is not shown entering the city at all. Just as an aside. Just remember that. He's there. And so it says, as they were walking along. I mean, when was the last time any of us just decided to walk to the neighboring town 25 miles away with our friends? I'm just saying. We don't generally put that on our schedule. We're going to do that. But it gives them an awful lot of opportunity to have a private conversation as they're walking along. They're just walking along the road. I don't know how long it would take them to walk 25 miles. I think it takes them about 2 days. I think they averaged about 12 miles a day. I think. I'll make sure I know about that. But I think it's a 2-day walk. The only thing that I could think of that is somewhat similar is, have you ever taken a really long car ride with a friend? Like you're going to drive let's drive straight to Denver. Okay? And you get in the car and you're with your friend and you just end up talking about who knows what, right? Because you're private in your closed space and you're going somewhere and you really don't care that if you stop where you stop or what, you just know where you're going and you just keep going and you have this amazing conversation and you find out all kinds of things, or you decide to do this, or you know what I'm saying. I remember having one with Dave Rod one time. We drove straight back from Petoskey together, and I learned things I had no idea about. He got so comfortable. It was a really good thing for our friendship. I think he regretted it, to be perfectly honest. But the point is, this is what we have going on right now. They went up, they're traveling as they're walking along. And what he asks them is really direct. Now, he does something, this is something that Jewish rabbis never did. They never asked their disciples a question. The disciples were supposed to ask the rabbi questions. But the reason he asks them is because he really actually wanted to know. He's not setting them up for something. He's not like giving them a question so that they can all fumble with it and then he can teach them some great truth. He wants to know what they're hearing. And he says what? He says, who do people say I am? Who do people say I am? By the way, both here and in the reply, there are 2 words, and it goes, and saying, Jesus asked, who do people say I am? It says, and saying. So we get the saying part and the ask. Now, this is unusual in the Greek to do this because what it does is it doubles up the importance of the fact that Jesus is saying something to them. He's asking them this question. And later on, it's going to say when they answered, it goes, and saying they answered. These are really important moments because they're doubled up in the verb of what they're doing. Does this make sense? Okay. Who do people, or literally men, but that's neither here nor there, say I am? Okay, up to this point, only two people, or not really people, but one person and then creatures have made any statement about who Jesus is. One of the demons, and you remember earlier where Jesus had to tell the demon yelled out, "You are the Christ," all this stuff, and he goes, "Shut it off, shut up." He doesn't want demons telling people who he is. That connection would be terrible. But Herod had thought who Jesus is. He said, who did Herod say Jesus was? Remember? He thought he was John the Baptist raised from the dead. Now, can we just talk about that a minute? I mean, you're not going to tell me no, are you? I mean, but first off, we know that to us that seems like very illogical. Why, we know that Jesus and John the Baptist actually were cousins, and their lives crossed. They were together. How could Jesus be John the Baptist raised from the dead? Well, we have to remember that when Herod had John the Baptist put to death, we don't know that he'd ever heard of Jesus. There's no proof that at that point in time that Herod knew about some Galilean guy who'd come down and got baptized. There's no telling. I mean, let's be honest. Herod was not particularly interested in the ongoings of the poor in Galilee. He was a Judean guy who was really upper class. He didn't care about any of those low lives up there in the north unless they got in the way. Unless they started to make a stink that got him in trouble and he had to deal with something. I am confident that Herod had never heard of Jesus at all when John the Baptist was killed. And yet all of a sudden somebody shows up and Herod feels what? Tremendously guilty about the fact that he got maneuvered by a little dancing girl into killing somebody that he had great respect for. And it would be just like God, wouldn't it, to raise that guy from the dead to what? Torment him. So it's not as far-fetched for Herod to think he's John the Baptist. Now, if people say he's John the Baptist, we're not going to get very far here. We've only got like a couple more minutes. But if the people say he's John the Baptist, they're not thinking raised from the dead. They're not thinking raised from the dead. Do you remember the story about Elijah and Elisha? And when Elijah was about to go, Elisha asked to have a double portion of the Spirit put on him. They would be thinking that Jesus had been anointed by the Spirit, the same Spirit that had anointed John the Baptist. And so when he says, who do people say I am? And he really wants to know what people are saying. They go, well, some say John the Baptist. And what they mean is another coming in the power of John the Baptist. Now, this is an interesting thing, and I don't have time to go into too much of it, but you know, Elijah was not particularly known as a miracle-working prophet, but Elisha almost identically mirrors all the miracle-working of Jesus. John the Baptist, we see none miracle-working power. He is a proclaiming prophet. And Jesus comes in miracle working power that almost mirrors Elisha's miracles. That's a powerful thing. And everybody believed that Elisha came in the power of Elijah, the same anointed spirit. And so that makes perfect sense that people would say, well, he's John the Baptist. He's the power that was resident in John the Baptist. And in John the Baptist, the power was in his what? Words. Okay? I got so much to say about Elisha, and we need to stop. Is this okay? Are you okay with it right here? Where we'll start next time is I'll re-up us a little bit on John the Baptist so we all know where we are. And then we'll jump into Elijah, because for them to say Elijah is a powerful thing. I just want to say one thing before we go. Notice in the text that Jesus never says, how crazy are these people? He never goes, well, those are honor. I mean, I guess it's an honor to think that I'm those people, but they're so wrong. He never says anything like that. Why? Because he doesn't want to denigrate these people, but also because they are all forerunners, forebearers of the news of his coming. And so he wants them to still be thinking about who those people are, because those people are the people that tell us that Jesus is coming. And so this is an interesting mix. Just notice how Jesus doesn't comment about any of this, but he lets the disciples tell him the truth. Okay? So, are we okay? Yep. All right. Hey, thanks for bearing with me tonight. I know it's a long evening, but thank you, and I will see you next Tuesday.